Hello and welcome to All Top 5s. It's undeniable that coincidences are rife throughout history, with some more profound than others. People like to read a lot into what they mean or see a conspiracy in things, but I'm going to focus on some true, real-life coincidences that have occurred and just let you make your own mind up as to whether it's simple coincidence or something darker at work. Number 5. Soldiers' graves. The First World War was one of the bloodiest conflicts in history. Devastatingly, there were more than 17 million deaths in total, such a tragic loss of human life on all sides of the war. Given the enormous death toll from the 4.5-year conflict, there's a genuine and incredible coincidence that came about after weapons were laid down. Private John Parr was the first British soldier to be killed in the First World War, shot by a German patrol in Obourg, Belgium. George Edwin Ellison, on the other hand, was the last soldier to be killed in the First World War, just an hour and a half before the armistice took effect, as he patrolled nearby Mons, also in Belgium. That's not the biggest coincidence in itself, though. Incredibly, out of more than 17 million deaths, both men were buried in the same place, the Saint-Symphorien military cemetery in Belgium. Moreover, their graves face one another, located in exactly the same little area of the cemetery, surrounded by trees and bushes. It's been confirmed that the bodies weren't put together intentionally, as it wasn't known that Ellison was the last person to be killed at the time, and the grave he ended up in just happened to be the next available plot. It's a baffling coincidence that serves as a powerful reminder of the incredibly sad loss of life from the First World War. Number 4. King Umberto's double. This coincidence is slightly cloudier as far as sources are concerned, but the general consensus is that it is genuine. King Umberto I of Italy ruled between 1878 and 1900 when he was assassinated. It's said that during his reign, Umberto visited a small restaurant in Monza, Italy for dinner with one of his aides. The restaurant owner, Umberto noticed, was practically his double, looking remarkably similar in both face and body. After they remarked on this coincidence, they discovered that they shared other features too. Both men were born on the same day, the 14th of March 1844, and in the same town, Turin in Sardinia. Taking this even further, Umberto and the restaurant owner who looked alike both married women called Margherita. Even further, the restaurant owner had opened his restaurant on the same day that the king was crowned. The two men became friends after this, and the coincidence reared its head once more on 29th of July 1900. Umberto was informed that his friend had been killed in a shooting accident that morning and was upset at the news. Later that very same day, though, the king himself was shot dead by an anarchist assassin in the crowd. So, from birth until death, the two men were coincidentally entwined. Number 3. Robert Todd Lincoln. Still on the gruesome theme of assassinations, we now turn to Robert Todd Lincoln. He was the politician's son of President Abraham Lincoln and was the subject of a series of coincidences that many believe was a curse of sorts, including Robert himself. Robert's father, President Lincoln, was assassinated at the Ford Theatre on 14th of April 1865. Robert himself wasn't present when it happened, but was at the White House only half a mile away and rushed to his father's deathbed across the street from the theatre. The only reason he hadn't been at the theatre with Abraham was that he was exhausted from a long trip. He had been invited. In fact, he claimed had he been there, the assassin couldn't have entered. But it wasn't just President Lincoln's assassination that Robert was linked to. When President James A. Garfield was delivering a speech at 6th Street Station in July 1881, he was shot at point-blank range by an assassin, all in front of the eyewitness Robert Todd Lincoln, linking him to a second assassination. It didn't stop there, though. In September 1901, Robert was in attendance at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, at the invitation of President William McKinley. This president was killed by an assassin with a gun, once again in the presence of Robert Lincoln. Robert himself noticed this trend. He once spoke of it regarding a later presidential invitation. "No, I'm not going, and they'd better not ask me, because there is a certain fatality about presidential functions when I am present." Yeah, and who can blame him? There is one final coincidence that is worth mentioning. In 1864, Robert fell off a train platform and was pulled out of harm's way by a man named Edwin Booth. This man who saved his life, or at least saved him from severe injury, was the brother of John Wilkes Booth, who would go on to kill Robert's father at the Ford Theatre little over a year later. Robert Todd Lincoln seemed to attract coincidences, it seems. Number 2. The Wreck of the Titan. Futility, also known as The Wreck of the Titan, is a novella by author Morgan Robertson written in 1898. Although it was written 14 years before the Titanic sank, and a long time before the Titanic was even thought up, it is spookily similar to the real event. There's a great number of coincidental similarities between the two events. The most obvious is the name. The fictional boat was the Titan, and the real ship was the Titanic. They were both propeller-driven vessels that were described as unsinkable. The Titan was 800 feet long to the Titanic's 882 feet, and weighed 45,000 tons, compared with Titanic's 46,000 tons. Both boats had a capacity of 3,000 people. The Titan was carrying 2.2 thousand passengers, and the Titanic was carrying 2.5 thousand. That's where it stops being similar and starts being exactly the same. The Titan was written to be moving at 25 knots when it hit an iceberg on its starboard side. The Titanic was moving at 22.5 knots when it hit an iceberg on its starboard side. On top of that, both events occurred at night time, in April, in the North Atlantic, exactly 400 nautical miles from Newfoundland, and both ships, of course, sank. There are other more technical similarities, but it's an incredible list even so. After the Titanic sank, people began to believe the author, Robertson, was psychic. He denied these claims and put the similarities down to his in-depth experience and knowledge of shipbuilding and seafaring technologies, rather than clairvoyance. An amazing set of coincidences nonetheless. Number 1. Church explosion. I'll end on a less creepy one, but no less incredible. On the 1st of March 1950, in Beatrice, Nebraska, an accidental but devastating explosion occurred at a small church. This happened at 7:25 p.m. A choir of 15 people was supposed to be there at 7:20 p.m., 5 minutes beforehand, for a practice. But, by fortuitous and incredible coincidence, every single person was late, so no one was actually present when the church exploded. How did this happen? Well, there's a reason for every single one of the 15 people. The Reverend Walter Klemple, his wife and daughter were held up by a dirty dress. The daughter needed a new one ironed at 7:10 when they were due to leave, so they were late as a result. LaDonna van der Grift, despite always arriving early for a practice, was having trouble with her high school homework and was staying late to finish off a geometry problem. Royena Estes and her sister were having trouble starting their car, and although they asked LaDonna for a lift, she was doing her geometry. Leonard Schuster had decided to skip practice that day, instead taking the daughter to a missionary meeting elsewhere, otherwise they'd have been there at 7:20 as usual. Herbert Kipf was running late for choir practice because he was finishing off an important letter. Joyce Black decided simply that it was such a cold evening, and so she'd stay warm in her home until the last possible moment, making her late. Harvey Ahl was late for choir practice that day as he was taking care of his 2 boys in his wife's absence, and they had distracted him from being on time. The pianist Marilyn Paul, although she'd planned on arriving 30 minutes early, had unusually fallen asleep after her dinner, and her mother had woken her up at 7:15, too late to arrive on time. In fact, the choir director was Marilyn's mother, and she was late because her daughter had slept in. Finally, 2 high school girls, Lucille Jones and Dorothy Wood, were late too, when they were normally very prompt. They were friends and neighbours, and Lucille was listening to a radio program that ended at 7:30 because she was so gripped by the show, and Dorothy had waited for her. So, for many different reasons, every single one of the 15 choir members had been late on the day they would otherwise have died. When asked about it afterwards, each member said they were maybe late 1 every 4 times. They'd never all been late at the same time before. Many people see it as a lucky coincidence, and many others believe it a form of divine intervention. Whichever way you look at it, it was definitely a 1 in several million stroke of good fortune. And that's it from All Top 5s for this week. Let me know what you think of these 5 in the comments, just remember to be polite. Please do hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and you can hit the subscribe button for weekly videos from me. So peace and love to each and every one of you, good fortune as well, and I'll see you all next time on All Top 5s.